Andrew Jackson Report Card by Helen Wan and Anusha Malkin. Election of 1824. During this election, Andrew Jackson received the largest number of votes, both by population and electoral, out of the 4 candidates, but nobody got a majority, so the vote went to Congress. John Quincy Adams was chosen by the Congress and became president. This was made up of 2 different reasons. The first one was that the Congress did not want a poor and uneducated person to be the president. This reason was actually used by Jackson in the election 4 years later because it could relate to the majority of the people in the United States. The second reason was that Adams made a deal with congressmen and offered them positions in the cabinet in exchange for votes. This was known as the corrupt bargain. In the corrupt bargain, Henry Clay, another presidential candidate, agreed to have his supporters vote for Adams in the congressional vote in return for the position of Secretary of State. This is a wanted position because many people who were in this position became president later. The corrupt bargain really ticked Jackson off because he believed it to be corrupted. I give Andrew Jackson an A because his performance was good and he earned the most electoral and popular votes. However, he was cheated out of the position due to corrupt bargain. Finally, I don't think that it is fair for the Congress to not vote for Jackson just because he's poor, since as an American citizen, Jackson should be able to be judged fairly to his leadership qualities instead of his social status. Spoil system. The spoil system is where a president, after winning the election, gives government jobs to his supporters, friends, and relatives as a reward of working toward the victory. This system was established by Andrew Jackson to gain loyal supporters. He also used it to fire government officials under opposing political parties. There was a lot of mudslinging in the election of 1828, and since Andrew Jackson's wife had divorced before marrying him, which was a big deal back then, they made campaigns about her. She couldn't take it, and one day she got a heart attack and died. When Jackson won the election, he saw all of the people in the other political party and didn't want them to stay because they harmed his wife, so he fired all of them. I gave Andrew Jackson a C for this because the spoil system wasn't fair to both the government officials that got fired and the people who voted for those government officials. Also, the spoil system makes Jackson quite a tyrant since he's not following the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. This means that the federal government only has the powers that are specifically given to them in order to create balance between the people and the federal government. The power to fire anyone he wanted and replace them was not given to Jackson. Though the spoil system is corrupted, it is understandable that Jackson acted like this after what happened to his wife and how he got cheated by the corrupt bargain in the election of 1824. Therefore, I stand by the score I gave Jackson, a C.
The Second National Bank was created as a result of the War of 1812 as they had economic problems when trying to fund the war and they didn't want to run into the same problem later into the future. Andrew Jackson wanted to shut down the bank as he thought it was unconstitutional and thought Congress shouldn't have the power to create it and thought it was biased towards the northern states as their economy was based on industries and people of higher society would invest and only wealthy people would invest into banks. For Jackson's re-election bid, he was focused on destroying the national bank, and as a result, he was easily able to win the election against Henry Clay. Jackson thought that majority of the people who voted for him wanted the bank to be closed down, so he fought hard for the termination of the bank. Jackson also thought that if the government oversaw the bank, government workers would be able to control the economy of the nation and corporations would take over the country. As a result of the charter not being renewed, the bank was closed down. I gave Andrew Jackson a C for this event because when the bank closed down, the country went into an economic depression. Once Martin Van Buren took office after Jackson, the country went through an economic recession, which eventually led to the Panic of 1837, where private banks closed down as they ran out of money. Although Jackson did not know that he would be causing an economic crisis, if he had not closed down the bank, the recession may not have happened. Another reason I gave Jackson a C is because the Second National Bank contributed significantly to economic stability and growth of our country. And as a result of Jackson closing the bank, the country experienced many economic problems which could have easily been prevented. Also, wars that America participated in would leave the country in debt, which made the government's financial situation even more difficult. The Second National Bank helped the country and the economy more than it harmed it, which is why I gave Jackson a C on the closing of the Second National Bank.
Georgia. Worcester v. Georgia is a case that the U.S. Supreme Court held on March 3, 1832. This case involved a group of Christian missionaries, including Samuel A. Worcester, who lived in the Cherokee Territory of Georgia. They advised the Cherokee tribe to resist Georgia's laws that were being imposed upon them, as the Cherokee Nation was granted independence from treaties with the United States government. Georgia wanted to stop the missionaries, so the state passed an act that forbade white people to live on Cherokee lands unless it was approved by the governor of Georgia and the person swore an oath to the state. The missionaries only did so to the U.S. federal government, so Georgia authorities arrested them. They were convicted at a trial in 1831 and were sentenced to 4 years of labor in prison. Worcester appealed to the Supreme Court. He argued that Georgia didn't have a right to extend its power into the Cherokee Territory. The Supreme Court agreed with Worcester, and he won the case on March 3, 1832. However, Georgia ignored the decision and kept the missionaries in prison. They were granted a pardon and released eventually in 1833. Worcester v. Georgia is an important case because it clarified that states do not have the right to force laws onto Native American land. Andrew Jackson did not reinforce the Supreme Court's decision, however, which allowed states to continue damaging Native American tribes. This later led to the event called the Trail of Tears. I gave Jackson a B for this event because he did not enforce the Supreme Court's decision, which pretty much didn't fulfill the checks and balances. He also allowed states to continue doing whatever they wanted with the Native American tribes, and though the missionaries had won the case, they weren't released from prison immediately. However, for the time being, this event did not have that big of an effect on the United States or people as a whole. Indian Removal Act and Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act, which was a law that allowed states to make trades with Native Americans to purchase their land. This especially targeted Georgia, since there was gold found there. This caused the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was where the federal government forced the Native Americans to leave their homes in the south of the United States and walk west to a specific area across the Mississippi River known as the Indian Territory. There were also the 5 civilized tribes that were Native American tribes that followed American culture by wearing the same clothing and creating a constitution. They included the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. This didn't prevent them from being sent to the Indian Territory. The events that led to the Trail of Tears include Worcester v. Georgia, Treaty of New Echota, and the Seminole Wars. Worcester v. Georgia is a Supreme Court case. The Treaty of New Echota was where a small group of Native Americans signed a treaty to receive money. They stated that the whole group of Native Americans would leave. Finally, the Seminole Wars were fought in Florida when Native Americans refused to leave. Andrew Jackson brought an army of 3,000 down to Florida and forced them to leave. I gave Andrew Jackson an E for this event because though he did not cause the entire event alone, the Indian Removal Act that he passed was the main cause of it. With land treaties now allowed, many of them were not fair and some of them were forced upon the Native Americans. It was more than forcing the Native American tribes to move away and leave their homes though. The traveling caused the deaths of so many people. The whole thing was to fulfill the greed people felt toward Native Americans' land and the gold that was found there. Also, though Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act was the main cause of the Trail of Tears, it happened during Martin Van Buren's presidency, so he pretty much got blamed for it by those that were unhappy with the Trail of Tears.
The nullification crisis arose in 1832. The crisis began when leaders of South Carolina felt that they should not have to follow the rules of federal laws. Jackson enforced an increased tariff on foreign imported goods. Since the North didn't use as many imported goods, they weren't affected as much as the South. The South relied on imported goods, and an increased tariff would be treating them unfairly while benefiting the North, as the tariff would force Southerners to purchase American-made goods. South Carolina ignored the tariff, calling it unconstitutional, hoping Jackson would support them, and threatened to secede from the country if he didn't. Jackson lowered the tariff, but also promised he would force them to pay if they didn't and if it was necessary. South Carolina felt that states could nullify the law, so the state passed the South Carolina Act of Nullification in November of 1832, which said that North Carolina could ignore the federal law. The idea was supported by South Carolinian John C. Calhoun, who was also Andrew Jackson's first-term vice president. Calhoun had to fight for his idea of nullification, but President Jackson was prepared for conflict. I chose to give Andrew Jackson a C for the event Nullification Crisis. One reason I decided to give a C is because, first of all, the Nullification Crisis was a precursor to the Civil War. If the Nullification Crisis didn't happen, and Jackson didn't fight so hard to make sure South Carolinians followed the tariff, the Civil War may have been delayed. Secondly, Andrew Jackson only looked at how it would help the North and the country's economy instead of how it would hurt the southern states. The reason the North and the South and the economy of the country was helped is because the tariff on imported foreign goods caused Southerners to mainly buy from the North, as it would be cheaper. Many Southerners thought that the Nullification Crisis favored one group, the Northerners, over another, the Southerners, and thought this was unconstitutional. When Jackson realized that the new tariff would be hurting the South, he didn't back down but instead fought harder to make them follow the new tariff law. Third, if Jackson knew that the tariff would be helping a portion of the country while hurting another part of the country, he shouldn't have created a tariff, as an argument was bound to happen between the two sides. Expansion of democracy. Mainly only free men who owned land were able to vote, and African American slaves and women were not able to vote. After the War of 1812, some states dropped their property requirements for voting from having to be a taxpayer or having served in the military to be eligible to vote. During the early 1820s, the public demanded voter eligibility spread. Although it was mainly focused on only men, it was a big step for opening up political involvement. The election of 1824 had a big impact for an increase in mass democracy for our country. During the years of 1824 to 1828, most states responded to the election by dropping their property requirements for voting. As a result, opening up the election abilities for free men over the age of 21. The expansion of democracy caused two distinct political parties. By the 1840s, around 80% of free adult males voted in each elections. The expansion of democracy had a large impact on social and political movements such as the abolition of slavery and increased movement towards women's rights. I chose to give Andrew Jackson an A for the event Expansion of Democracy. The first reason is because the ideals he set and what he wanted for the country were appropriate for the people who wanted to vote, but weren't allowed to, and were underprivileged in the voting category. For example, in the years following the election of 1824, Jackson's supporters opened up offices around the country to coordinate his campaign message. This allowed more people to hear about his ideals and could have pushed them to want to vote, which eventually led to movements. Another reason I gave Jackson an A is because he was able to campaign well enough where more people could hear about what he was trying to achieve during his presidency. This helped more people hear about him and the type of presidency he would be able to run, and caused more people to vote. One more reason I gave Jackson the grade I gave him is because he was able to please people enough where they would open up offices to campaign for him. This helped in the expansion of democracy because political parties were able to be formed. That is why I stand by the score I gave Jackson, which is an A. And then these are all the sources that we used together.